What? We've got 130 amps outside. It is pretty nice and sunny. A little bit of cloud situation here, but mostly sunny. So maxing out the solar energy on the garage, on the carport, on the shed, on the tilt system. Everything goes in the battery. It will be full in about... So my friends, in today's video we want to start upgrading the battery shelf, as I have promised you many times. Today is the day, and you have already seen the new system. And when I told you it is made in Australia, most of you thought about the Batrium BMS. But no, it is not the Batrium BMS. Some will be very happy now, some will be very sad. I'm getting very mixed feedback about the Batrium BMS. Some say it has long known issues with the firmware. Some others say it's working fine. No, I'm not upgrading the battery shelf with the Batrium BMS. Well, and some others were hoping for the do-it-yourself BMS from Stuart, but this is not made in Australia, right? So it couldn't be the do-it-yourself BMS. And I'm sure we will test the do-it-yourself BMS here at some stage on the channel. As I said in my comments, I've got really difficulties to get all the parts together. And then I haven't got any equipment to solder SMD parts. But some of you have already offered a BMS ready built and ready soldered to me for testing. And I'm also in contact with Stuart, the man himself. So I'm sure we get something done in the future, and I'm testing the do-it-yourself battery here at some stage. But today we want to have a look at something completely different. And I never said I'm going to upgrade the BMSs. I never said I'm going to swap or replace the BMSs. The only BMS I'm going to replace is the Heltec BMS here on the top battery shelf, because this has some software limitations, some bugs. It doesn't measure the current correctly, and there's no way to calibrate it somehow. And the balancing function is buggy as well, as you know. It keeps cell 1 to 10 on a higher voltage than all the other cells. So something is wrong with the balance or charging algorithm in this BMS. So I will swap the Heltec BMS with a very special JK-BMS. It's already ordered, it's on its way, it's not here yet, but it doesn't matter, we can already start upgrading the battery shelf with the new system. Well, this is only something you always assumed, that I will replace all the BMSs in the battery shelf. But why should I do that? Because I already have the best BMS on the market installed. The JK-BMS here in the middle shelf. The best on the market. It's got a 2 amp active balancer, works perfectly fine. All the settings are intuitive, easy to set. And even this is the first generation of the JK-BMS, so it needs this 5 volt start voltage, this jump starter. But I never turn off these BMS anyway. So I have already the best BMS ever on the market. Why should I swap it for something else? And Medi's 100 amp Overkill BMS here, the modded JBD-BMS. Yeah, it's working okay down here on the bottom shelf, so there's no real reason to replace it. At some stage I may do, but I also want to show you the integration of this new system. So it's good to have these different BMSs here in the battery shelf. I really need this battery here for a moment. Just for demonstration purposes. And we also need a BMS. Again, this is only for demonstration purposes, so I'm not going to connect this to this battery. A charger. Got one. And a solar panel. So here we have our classical setup, battery, BMS and a charger. This could be either an inverter or an MPPT solar charge controller. Solar panel produces energy, inverter or MPPT solar charge controller goes into your BMS and charges your battery. And you are setting all your charge parameters inside the inverter or MPPT solar charge controller. The BMS here acts only as a pure safety device. Basically, this is your breaker. On. The BMS lets energy through if all your charging parameters are within the specifications you have set in the BMS. So you know, the voltage needs to be between 2.5 volts and 3.65 volts. The ambient temperature of your battery needs to be within the thresholds you have set in the BMS. And the BMS also monitors your charge and discharge current. If either is too high, the BMS will disconnect the battery. So all your charging parameters are set in the inverter. And then once the battery is full, the inverter turns off. So the inverter is actually nothing else than a switch to turn off power, to charge your battery when it's full, and to turn it back on when the battery is empty. You got a power switch and you got your safety device here. This one charges your battery, this one protects your battery. So, and as you know, these inverters and MPPT solar charge controllers have sometimes only limited capabilities of setting the correct profile to charge lithium iron phosphate batteries. So most of the time you cannot set any absorption time in the inverters, or a float voltage afterwards, a rebulk voltage. So almost all the inverters out there have some sort of limitation and are not 100% ideal to charge your lithium batteries. And of course, there's no communication between the BMS and your charger. So if your battery gets too hot, for example, the BMS realizes that, but is not communicating this to your inverter. So the inverter keeps charging full blast whatever your solar produces into your battery. And at some stage, if the battery gets too hot, the BMS will just disconnect the battery for safety reasons. And it does exactly the same if one of your cells hit the 3.65 volts you have set as a safety parameter in your BMS. Or the charging current exceeds 100 amps you have set in the BMS. It just flicks the breaker and protects your battery. This is the main purpose of the BMS, monitoring and protecting. Okay, it does the balancing part as well, but most BMSs are really bad with balancing anyway, so... Okay, then, without further ado, let me introduce you to the JK-BMS interface board. Yep, that's it. This is all it is. This is the new system. Yeah, let's do a very quick walk around here. So the heart of the JK-BMS interface board is an ESP32 processor. 2 buttons here, left and right, of a USB-C 5-volt connector. And on the other side, you can have 1 or 2 RJ45 connectors. And also this little guy there. Look at this. A JST, whatever it says here. Yeah, it also comes with this, more about this in a second. So this is basically the whole interface board. I'm not going to say JK-BMS interface board all the time now. We should come up with something easier, like the Peter board, because this board is developed by Peter. And a couple of weeks ago, I met Peter in Brisbane here in Australia. And since then, we are in contact almost every single day and bouncing ideas back and forward. And Peter is always asking how the board works, how I find it, and I always have to tell him, Peter, I haven't installed the board yet. It is still not installed. I haven't made the video yet. So let me tell you what the Peter board actually does. So the Peter board sits right in between the BMS and your charger. And it replaces the charging function of your inverter and is adding a lot more functionality. Switching, dimming, main switch functionality. So all these new features we always wanted are integrated in this little guy. And the Peter board gets all the information from the BMS. So the safety functionality still stays with your BMS. So it still monitors all your cells for voltage, current and temperature. But the actual charging of your battery will be controlled by the Peter board now. And your inverter is just listening to what the Peter is telling it. And you know, we are fighting with Seplos and the guys from Pace BMS and the Tagaluma BMS and now the JK-BMS, because there's always some functionality in these BMSs which is not quite working. They either charge to a fixed bulk voltage and then keep the battery there, this higher voltage, which is not ideal. They've got no absorption time. Some inverters hit the absorption voltage and then turn off charging altogether without giving the battery time to absorb. And none of the inverters out there have actually a float mode, as far as I know. So they are all suboptimal for charging a lithium battery. And this is exactly where the PIDA board comes into the play now. This eliminates all the flaws and all the limitations of the BMS. So because this thing looks like complicated with all these connectors and everything, let me quickly show you how to connect this one to your JK-BMS. The PIDA board also comes with this small cable which plugs in here. Yeah. And then you take your JK-BMS and have a look at the GPS port. Because this in reality is not a GPS port, it is a 3.3 volt TTL connector. Alright. And this concludes the connection of the PIDA board. One connector, one cable connected from the PIDA board to the BMS, and that's it. This is all. This is all the installation. Really. I'm not kidding. Well, of course not quite, because we also have the RJ45 ports, right? So what the PIDA board actually does now, it collects all the information from the JK-BMS, processes them in the ESP chip, and then converts all this information into a CAN protocol. So the only thing you need to do is connect your RJ45 from here, and you use the other end and plug this into your inverter. In reality, you've got your inverter here with a CAN interface, and this is where the cable plugs in. And the PIDA board does not only run with Victron systems, it runs with most other inverters as well. So it says it here, it is compatible with the PylonTech version 1.3 and GoodV 1.5. And most inverter will implement the PylonTech protocol anyway. So you just tell your inverter, I've got a PylonTech battery, and then the PIDA board does the rest for you. Okay guys, I would say without further to do, let's install the PIDA board on our real version 1, generation 1 JK-BMS. You can see I've already taken out all the screws of our front panel, so we can easily access the JK-BMS and connect the PIDA board. So I have already removed the glass front of our battery shelf. We've got the BMS here, but we need to turn it off to install the PIDA board. So I'm just flicking this switch here, and the BMS is still running. And because this one doesn't have an on-off switch, I'm just pulling all the balance cables out like this. And now the BMS is turned off. So here we can see the GPS and RS485 port. And this is exactly where the connector plugs in. There we go. And this concludes the installation of the PIDA board. Okay, balance cables back in. And 2. And we can see a red light on the PIDA board. It fires up automatically. BMS has already started, as you could hear. So the PIDA board also provides an auto start for my very old JK-BMS here. I don't need to jump start it anymore with a 5 volt. Okay, this is all we need to do. PIDA board is installed to our JK-BMS. This is all. I know, we still need to connect the CAN port of the PIDA BMS to our Raspberry Pi CAN adapter. Let's turn on the power of this battery again. No sparks, no smoke, just works. We've got 40 degrees outside. It is really time that we get an air condition here in the off-grid garage. So, and this is now wired as per inverter standard. We've got pin 4, so counting from the left, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is our blue cable here. This is CAN high. Pin 5 from the left is our white blue cable, which is CAN low. So I have now connected our LAN cable here to our CAN head on the Raspberry Pi, and I fed the green cable here through our battery compartment, busbar compartment down there, bypasses this compartment and comes out here again. So I have not connected it to the PIDA board yet, because I want to connect this one to our Wi-Fi first. So once the PIDA board is connected to your BMS and the lights are on, the red is for power and blue is for communication, You may have to press the reset button here to start the ESP, or there, you start the ESP, and this will then fire up its internal access point. So, and then after going into your Wi-Fi settings, you can see the BMS interface SSID, or the internal access point of the PIDA board. So you can then connect to the BMS interface access point and enter the details for your own home Wi-Fi. This will then connect the PIDA board to your existing Wi-Fi. Once it has connected to the Wi-Fi, several things are happening. And one of these amazing things which is happening is, because you have connected the PIDA board to your own network now, you can navigate to JK-BMS interface, and we can log in with the username BMS and the password can, or lowercase, sign in. And now the internal web browser of the PIDA board shows you this. So you've got a two-split screen here. On the left, you've got all the parameters, all the settings for the JK-BMS. And on the right-hand side, you've got the log files running through. So you can see the communication and also troubleshoot if something is not working. And just let me scroll through all the settings you can see from the JK-BMS now. Have a look on this long list on the left. Everything is there. Everything. So these are all the settings you have set in your JK-BMS, all the voltages, all the temperatures, all the amps, everything, plus a lot more which we even don't see in the mobile app for the JK-BMS. I can, for example, see I've got a deviation of 14 millivolt in this battery bank. The charging power is 156 watts, and I have set an overcurrent protection of 110 amps. And here I have all my single cell voltages as well. So, but the really interesting part is here at the top, because these are the parameters which you can change. And the change is not going into your JK-BMS, because this is your safety device. Whatever you set in the JK-BMS stays like this in the JK. You won't be able to change any settings in the JK-BMS. And whatever changes you make on this website here, these changes will be sent to your inverter. So the inverter acts on your changes and charges the battery accordingly. So here at the top, you can set your CAN protocol to whatever inverter you have. You can set the protocol to communicate with a BYD inverter, a D inverter, a GoodWe, a Pylon, or the Victron system. Obviously, I've chosen the Victron system, but even selecting the Pylon works for me just fine. So this should work for your inverter as well. And then we can see an absorption voltage of 55.2 volts here, which I can change. I click on the slider and use the left-right keys. So I can set my absorption voltage to 56 volts, for example, with an absorption time of 30 minutes. I can change this as well. And this information would be sent to your inverter. So it charges now to 56 volts and will hold the voltage there for 30 minutes. What happens afterwards? Well, if float mode is activated, as it is here, it will then lower the voltage after 30 minutes to your set rebulk offset. That would mean in this case here 56 volts minus 2.5 volts. So that is 53.5 volts. So it would float at 53.5 volts. And it would do this. Just above we've got the float time for 6 hours. And then it would start a new cycle. If you have a Victron system, for example, your MPPT solar charge controllers or your Multiplus will do this automatically after the sun has set and there's no solar power coming in anymore. The Victron system realizes, well, the day is over and the next time there is solar power available, it starts a new cycle. And we can simulate exactly this with a PIDA board, because whenever you hit your float voltage, you can set the timer for the float time according to your circumstances and to the design of your system. So your inverter would charge the battery to 56 volts, hold the voltage there for 30 minutes to allow the balancer to do its job, then lower the voltage by 2.5 volts to a float voltage, and then keep this float voltage for 6 hours. Yeah, it keeps the battery 100% charged at a lower voltage. And then after 6 hours, presumably after sunset, it starts a new cycle, and the next morning it will charge to 56 volts again. So can your inverter do that? Potentially not. Can your BMS do that? Potentially not. There are certain BMSs on the market like the Batrium, the Rec BMS or the do-it-yourself BMS, which have kind of float settings as well. But everything we have tested so far here in the Off-Grid Garage cannot do that. And this is exactly the functionality we always wanted. Yeah, Seplos BMS charges to 56 volts and stays there forever. Pace BMS does exactly the same. Charge to 56 volts, stays there. There's no float setting, nothing. The JK inverter BMS, exactly the same, charges to 56 volts and then stays there. So they all do a bulk or absorption voltage, but nothing like an absorption time and a float mode afterwards. Well, now with the Peter board you can. And you can see you can adjust all these settings, right? All of them. So what happens if you turn off float mode? You can see the charging status is bulk at the moment because we haven't reached the 56 volts yet. So after we hit the 56 volts, the charging status will change to wait. Wait will tell the inverter to stop charging altogether. It sets the CCL, the charge current limit, to 0. Yeah, ours is still sitting on 100 amps. This would then go to 0. So there's no further charge coming into the battery at 56 volts. The balancer would kick in of your BMS because it's configured to balance at this voltage. And the voltage of your battery will slowly go down. Naturally. It doesn't stay at 56 volts. And it will go down over time until it hits the rebulk offset voltage as well, which is our float voltage. At this point of time, it will not float, it will not stay there because we have just turned off float mode. It will then do a rebulk. So the charging status changes from wait to bulk again, and it charges again to 56 volts. So if this is something you want to do, you can with the Peter board. Can your inverter do this? Or your BMS? Most likely not. So I don't really like this function because the Peter board would tell my solar charge controllers now to turn off charging. That means they stop producing power altogether. And all my load in my system would now be powered by the battery. So I'm discharging the battery straight away when I hit 56 volts. And that's why I have asked Peter to put a float mode into the Peter board. And he did. So whatever your system design is, if you are off-grid, if you are on-grid, if you have Victron MPPTs, which are more intelligent and listening to your BMS, for example, than other MPPTs, or if you have a D or Pylon Tech inverter, it doesn't matter. You can now fine-tune and set your exact charging algorithm as you want it. So I'm turning float mode back on because I want the voltage to go down to float voltage and then stay there for the rest of the day. So as you can see, this is intelligent now, which we can get out of a normal JK-BMS, which has none of these settings. There's no bulk voltage or absorption timer or float mode or anything like this in here. Nothing. This is just a dumb BMS which protects your battery. But the Peter board makes it intelligent now because the Peter board tells the inverter to act as per your settings. Okay, boys and girls, I think it is time now to connect the CAN cable to our Peter board and see how my Victron reacts to it. Connected. And immediately you can see that the blue light starts flashing. And when the blue light flashes, that is good, because this means it is communicating with our Victron system already. And holy shit, you can see the communication already here on the right hand side now in the communication window. You can see all the CAN IDs and the hex numbers behind it, where the Peter board sends the information from the JK-BMS to our Victron system. Okay, let's log into our Victron remote console, go into the settings, and let's have a look in the device list if we can see. Oh, there it is. There's our JK-BMS interface, short the Peter board. We can see the state of charge of the JK-BMS. Under details we can see the lowest and highest voltage and temperature, how many battery modules are online, and we can also see the capacity installed and available. So let's have a look in the parameters, and here we can see 55.2 volts, 100 amps charging and 100 amps discharging. This is the maximum I'm allowing the BMS to do. But if we have a look at the JK-BMS via the Bluetooth app and go into settings, we can see I have actually allowed the BMS to discharge and charge with 200 amps, because this is a 200 amp BMS, so it can do 200 amps. But the Peter board is only allowing a max current of 100 amps in and out of this BMS, because I have overwritten these information. So the JK-BMS itself does the protection, but the actual settings in your inverter will be done by the Peter board. So whenever I change my CCL, my charge current max in the Peter board, you can see the CCL changes in the Victron system as well, as it will be in your inverter. And why would you do this? Well, I'm doing this all the time because my battery gets hot and I have to lower the charge current. I don't want to have the battery sitting on 35 degrees and charging with 200 amps. So I'm lowering the charge current to 100 amps via this tool. And you can also do the same with the discharge current. If you have a hybrid inverter, for example, you can limit the discharge current and your inverter will only take this amount of amps out of your battery and the rest from the grid to support your load. And changing the absorption voltage, for example, I can also do this here via the website, and the Peter board will tell your inverter how far to charge. So if I want to increase from 55.2 to 56 volts, for example, I do this here in the web interface, and you can see the CVL changes immediately in your system. And again, this is not Victron specific. This works with all inverters which can talk pylon tech, which should be all of them. I'm not aware of any CAN connected inverter which doesn't do pylon tech. If I change mine to pylon, go into my charge current and change this one to 85, for example, you can see the CCL changes to 85 straight away. Up to 90, bang, 90 in the CCL in my Victron system. Even it sits on pylon. I can also, with a click of a button, disable charging altogether. There, CCL goes to 0. Yeah, and again, this will only be sent to your inverter, so your inverter stops charging. It will not disable your charge MOSFETs in your JK-BMS. And the Peter board has also a very cool feature which is called charging manually top balance. So if you turn this one on, your charging status changes to bulk manually, and the inverter will now charge your battery to 56 volts and keep it there. It stays there until you turn off this button again. And this can be used, for example, if you want to top balance your battery. You charge to 56 volts and then let the balancer do all your top balancing. In the morning you turn off this switch again and it goes into the normal charging and discharging cycle again. Fantastic feature. Can your BMS do that? Can your inverter do that? Probably not. I have never seen this before. This was already part of the initial firmware. Very cool feature, and I will use that. And I want to show you very quickly another feature now of the Peter BMS in the Victron system. So if you go to settings and go into the system setup, have a look under battery monitor, we can now see we've got the JK-BMS as a battery monitor available. So we are not using the smart shunt anymore in the Victron system then. We are using the JK-BMS, exactly all the numbers and figures which are displayed here. So it uses this voltage, these amps, these temperatures, and puts this all into the Victron system or in your inverter. So I'm not going to do this right now because I want to show you this in a separate video, because we have to do more settings. I want to see how the MPPT solar charge controllers react to it, as well as the Multiplus and the AC coupled tilt system. But this video here is more about the Peter board and its features. And then of course later on we also can set the BMS control in the DVCC and give full control to our JK-BMS then. So the JK-BMS controls our whole system. You can see the Peter board is still running and flashing here, and I want to show you something here on the back side of the Peter board. There you can see it. I'm zooming in a bit here. It says CAN term, and you can see the solder plop underneath. That means there's a CAN termination on this board here. So this is the last board in a chain of boards I can connect to our CAN system. Because clearly we have not only just one JK-BMS, we also have another one soon, and we also have the Overkill. Oh, that's not a JK, that's a JBD. and we cannot use this board here. But we can use a JBD slave board. Yes, and you can see this looks a little bit different to the JK-BMS board, and it also has additional connectors on the back here. So here you can see the JK board and the JBD board next to each other. And this is the brand new JK-BMS board, which has a DC to DC converter already on it. And that's why we need to plug in only this one cable, because it also gets the full battery power through this cable and then steps it down to 5 volt, which the electronic needs. Unfortunately, the JBD-BMSs, they don't support that. They don't have the full battery voltage or any voltage on these connectors here. This is just a communication connector where your Bluetooth plugs in. And Peter told me it can deliver only about 10 milliamps or something to support the Bluetooth module. But this is not enough to power the Peter board here for the JBD-BMS. So that's why we have a USB-C connector on this side. This needs additional power, 5 volts. And see there? CAN term. There's no solder plop. This is not the end of our CAN chain. And Peter makes these boards only for the JK-BMS and the JBD or Overkill BMSs, because who hasn't got a JK-BMS yet? Who? Exactly. He reckons most of the people will have the JK-BMS or the JBD or an Overkill BMS. So this should already cover about 80% of the market now. Yeah, I know there's the DIYBMS still, but how many people still using DALI? Except for the Gary in Scotland. And I've asked him how much effort it is to develop another board for the DIYBMS, for example, or for an AND BMS or whatever else people using. And he said this is a lot of developing time to find out what kind of protocol they are using and developing such a board specifically to this hardware. So at the moment, JK, Overkill, JBD. But while we are on this topic here, he's also developing a CAN-to-CAN board at the moment, which can potentially connect to a Zeplos BMS, to a Pace BMS, take the information via CAN, and then forward all this data to your inverter with the settings we have just seen. So making the Zeplos and Pace BMS the almost perfect BMS. The almost perfect because, well, the balancing still sucks in both BMSs. This is why I told you a couple of times in the comments now, keep your old JK BMSs. They are gold. If you want to, you can put a Peter board on these BMSs and make them super highly intelligent. As you have seen, you can set your perfect charging algorithm and your inverter and charger will just follow what the Peter board tells them. Before we are going to connect the JBD slave board here as well, I want to show you something else, because I told you once you connect the Peter board to your Wi-Fi, several things are happening. You have seen some of them now, but wait, there's more. So, and because the Peter is on your network now, and if you have Home Assistant installed, guess what? You get a notification straight away. New devices discovered. Check it out. And you have the ESP home integration automatically installed with one device found, which is our Peter. So in here we got all the device information, everything, and you also have a controls dashboard already made for us, fully automatically. I have not done anything. And you click on Add Dashboard, and I want this to My Energy, and Add to Dashboard. That's it. If I go to My Energy, I have now the JK-BMS Interface Master, which is the Peter. All of the adjustable parameters are here in Home Assistant automatically. But you can also add all of these sensors here to your Home Assistant dashboard, whatever you like, the actual battery capacity, the alarm, the single cell voltages, all of them. They are over 100, it says it somewhere, 105 entities. Isn't that crazy? And because we have just integrated the Peter board into our Home Assistant, we don't have a history, but over time, you will have a history of all your 16 single battery cells from this one BMS. And if I install all these slaves on the other two banks, I can monitor every single cell voltage from my mobile phone wherever I am. And I have also full control from my mobile phone. I can, for example, change the charge current from 90 amps to 111 amps if I want to. I can lower the absorption voltage from 56 volts to 55.2, because this is what I usually do. There we go. I can also turn off charging for this BMS altogether. Charge current limit 0 amps. All from a fingertip on your mobile phone. And of course you can just drag and drop your own dashboards as you want them with all the information you're interested in about this one battery bank, and you can have a different setup for the next battery bank and another different setup for the third battery bank. So before we install the JBD slave here in our JBD or Overkill board, we have to make sure all the settings are correct in the BMS, because we won't have access to the BMS afterwards anymore. To connect this board here, we have to disconnect the Bluetooth module, unfortunately. And I think this is why Peter has got two connectors on the other side. So you can connect one to the board and the other one goes your Bluetooth module in. So you have actually access to Bluetooth again. But there are some problems with the Overkill BMS in terms of communication then. So this feature is not yet working, and hopefully it's just a software update away. So in here the installation is a bit easier, because the Overkill BMS has got a power button, and we just turn off the BMS and disconnect the Bluetooth module and plug this port into the Peter slave board. There we go. You will notice there's no light because, as I said before, the JBD or Overkill BMS is not supplying any battery power through these cables here. This is pure communication with only 10 milliamps or something, so it's not enough to power this board. Unfortunately, we have to use this 5-volt port here. So I've got a 5-volt power supply here. We plug this in. Light comes on. Okay, I have now connected the JBD Overkill slave BMS board as well. You can see the blue light is flashing there. There's communication, and I've only plugged in a standard LAN cable into one of the ports of the slave and connected it to the master BMS on the other side. So the master board is now connected to the slave on one side and to our Raspberry Pi or to your inverter on the other side. And because the master board has also got the CAN termination soldered, it should be the last one in the row to terminate your CAN bus. But Peter told me it doesn't really matter, as long as these connections between the master and the slaves are short, it will still work. So eventually, when we have all three BMSs set up, this one will be the last one in the chain. And of course the cabling will be nice and neat. This is just for demonstration purposes now, so it's not staying like this, of course. This is... There's a big storm coming through at the moment. Holy shit. I hope the panels at the pool fence will survive. So far they are still here. So once you have your JBD slave board connected, you connect to the slave access point and then provide the credentials for your own Wi-Fi. It's the same procedure, the same process as for the master BMS. And here in the JK-BMS interface master or the Peter board, you can see that it has already recognized one slave. So the JBD is sending all the information to the master now, and the master is collecting all the information from the slaves connected and then sends this all to your inverter. So a discharge current of 100 amps in each of the BMS will be sent as a 200 amp DCL to your inverter. And if I go into the JBD board and lower my discharge current just for the JBD board, you can see it lowers it automatically as a sum. 100 amps for the JK-BMS and 90 amps for the JBD-BMS. Makes 190. If I turn off charging for the JBD altogether, it shows only the current available for the JK-BMS. It's getting really loud. And you can see how these slave BMSs integrate into the whole system now, fully automatically. It is a true plug-and-play solution. You connect the Peter boards to your BMS, connect it to power if it's a JBD BMS, and you're good to go. And then interlink them with normal LAN cables, and all the aggregated information will be sent to your inverter. And then you have all the information at your fingertips. That is amazing. Fully automatically, no scripting, no coding, no tweaking of files or something, nothing. Plug and play. All right, guys, I think so far the little upgrade we have done to the battery shelf this afternoon. I'm still waiting for the other JK-BMS to come in, and then we can install the second client as the second slave as well and connect it, and then we are fully integrated with these Peter boards and the Victron system. And of course, these boards are not free, they cost money. And a Peter board for a single BMS starts from $110 US, but you get a 25% discount if you join Peter's Patreon channel. Yep, support Peter, join the community. I am a member there as well, so maybe we can hang out there as well and discuss some things. And I think he sells them far too cheap, because this is the solution. This makes the best BMS even better. You know what I mean. So why would you wait for Chinese companies to make a software which is already working here in this Peter solution? Seplos will never do it. They are not making their own software. I've contacted the engineers from Pace and never heard back. So most likely they won't implement something like this either. So at the moment, I'm highly recommending buying the old style JK-BMS and a Peter board to make it the best, really the best BMS out there on the market. If you have multiple battery banks in parallel, you need to buy a Peter BMS for each of your BMSs, of course. I know this is additional money, but you just spend $2.5 grand on your battery bank, another $250 on the BMS, and you probably spend less money on the Peter board than you have spent on all your cables for your system. So in perspective, this thing does it all. And now the new version has also the DC-DC converter, so you don't need the 5-volt power supply anymore. It gets all the power from your battery directly. As always, guys, I link all the information under the video as well as on my website. I'm really trying to support Peter here. He's doing this all in his free time. So if you are interested in these Peter boards, please join his Patreon channel. You get a 25% discount for these boards. And again, guys, if you already have a JK-BMS, don't wait for the inverter BMS. I'm not sure if they will ever pull it off and fix the software. This solution here is already working perfectly fine. And as I said, he is also working on a can-to-can Peter board, which I have suggested also could include some relays, contactors, so we can activate active balancer. So we can still use the Seplos and Pace BMSs for the safety parts, checking on your voltages, current and temperatures, and then have the new Peter board doing all the rest like absorption time, float mode, float time, and the active balancing as well. So there is further development happening. So this one won't change because so many people out there already have the JK or the JBD-BMS. So there will be very interesting stuff coming from Peter here in Brisbane in Australia. Yep, this thing is Australian made from obviously Chinese parts. So yeah, guys, that's the solution. It's not a new BMS, it's not a different BMS. It is the same good old JK-BMS because it is already the best one on the market. And now with the Peter board, it is the best BMS on the market altogether. All right, guys, so far this video from today. Leave all your comments, all your questions down below. I think Peter will read through all of them and is present in the comments as well to answer all your questions. Try to support him through his Patreon channel so you can also be part of further development of this as well as the new can-to-can communication board. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Thanks for all your great support here, for all these generous and beautiful people out there who have donated to the channel, buying me a beer in these hot climates. You have seen me sweating today. We had like 40 degrees when I started filming, and now after the storm, the temperature is down to beautiful 22. Until the next video, guys, you stay charged, stay safe, and thanks again for watching. See you then. Bye-bye. Yeah, I'm not sure if he likes the name Peter board, because his name is not Peter, but I don't want to call it JBD-BMS Interface Master.